Criticism. The Plato views of poetry. The English criticism started from this man, and especially his criticism on poetry. So in detail, we discuss the different forms and his views about poetry. Plato's literary criticism, especially his views on poetry, inaugurates a new phase in critical development. He was a teacher and philosopher. He had his own academy to which people used to come from distant parts of the country, and his object was to make young men fit to be the leaders and rulers of an ideal state. In order to understand correctly Plato's theory of poetry and his attack on it, it is necessary to keep it in mind that the aim of his literature was frankly utilitarian. For example, educating the youth and forming them into good citizens of his ideal state. From this practical point of view, he made a wise attack on poetry. Secondly, in order to correctly understand Plato's views on poetry, it is essential to understand the contemporary state of affairs in Athens. Athens was a Greek capital in that time. First, it was a time of political decline and its dissolutions. Education was in a poor state. The epics of Homer was considered to be the school curriculum. They were venerated by the Greek just like the Bible, but in Homer there are many stories which represent the gods in unfavorable light. So there were allegorical interpretations of these stories were so considered unconvincing and difficult to understand. Secondly, courage, heroism, magnificence, and skills, and the use of arm were the virtues prized highly by the Greeks. Thirdly, the wonderful flowering time of Greek art and literature was over, and the creative impulse had practically died away. Literature at that time was largely immoral, corrupt, and degenerated. Poetry was decadent, and so was the object of much hostile criticism. Fourth, as a criticism of philosophers and writers were regarded superior to poets and artists. Confusion was prevalent in all spheres of life, intellectual, moral, political, and educational. There was a constant debate between the philosopher and the poets regarding their respective significance. Plato tries to demonstrate the practical superiority of philosophy over poetry, though much of his criticism is thus covered by social and political conditions of his age. Yet his criticism has much value and significance. He gave new directions to later criticism. Now coming to the topic, the Plato attack on poetry, and how he attacked, on what ground he attacked on poetry. It must be judged with reference to its political and social context, for all his efforts were devoted to avoid the deteriorations of character to restore the health of both the individual and the state. He judges poetry from his point of view, attacks poetry and drama on the moral, emotional, and intellectual grounds. On moral grounds, he says poetry is not conducive to social morality, on which pander to the population, popular taste and narrates tales of men pleasing vices. This creates demoralizing effect. Some of the case with drama, which depends entirely on popular patronage. Poets tell lies about gods, goddesses, and great heroes are represented as corrupt, immoral, dishonest indeed, subject to all the faults, follies, and vices of the common human being. It has been done even by Homer, thus they deprive public taste and morality and militate against reverence for the gods. He says that the work of the poet like Homer must not be prescribed for school study because in this way children intend to imitate the doings of gods and other heroes as told to them by these poets and by their mothers. As regards the allegorical interpretation of poetry, Plato says that it is certainly beyond the understanding and reach of the young. Homer therefore cannot be suitable medium for educations. Philosophy alone is the proper subject of the study. Thoroughly drama is even more harmful subjects and the dramatic methods is left to the reader and the result is lawlessness. Poet and dramatist appeal to the baser instinct of man, their love of sensational and melodramatic. The vulgar and morbid attitudes is thus fostered. He also criticized poetry on emotional grounds, for poetry has certain inherent weakness which makes it suitable for fostering wisdom and morality. These inherent weaknesses of drama and poetry are, according to Plato, these the poet says that they are divinely inspired. It means they do not compose poetry as a craft, but they compose poetry by virtue of some impulse of mysterious, non-rational, supernatural source. Outside their own personality, they speak unconsciously what the muse impels them to say. Like fountains, they allow to flow out freely what comes to it. Hence their pronouncements are unreliable and uncertain. There might be some truth in them, for they are divinely inspired, but such partial and imperfect truth must be carefully examined. Such truth can be no substitute for knowledge based on reason. Moreover, their meaning is not always clear. They are often full of obscurities and contradictions. The poets, with their emotional frenzies and lack of moral restraint, can offer no safe guidance, and moral or intellectual. Often the poets cannot themselves explain what they write. Allegorical interpretation might be clever, but their uses is there beyond the reach of the young and immature. Excluding lyric poetry, which is narrative, all other poetry, epic, tragedy, and comedy, is imitative, and Plato regard all imitative poetry as pernicious. In imitative poetry, the poet and the reader as well identify himself completely with the factitious character of the poetry. It enfeebles their character and personality. Imitation soon becomes a second nature, and the actor who imitated tend to behave like the object of his imitations. Thus, one who imitates a female part tend to grow effeminate. Imitationally will make him cowardly, knavish, or clownish. If such rules are immediately frequently, Plato divides the souls into three parts: rational, spirited, desirous, or repetitive. He said the poets, whether epic or tragic, comic, on board in the vulgar, the sensationals, the corrupt element. Reason is thus kept abeyance and full sway is given to the emotions. Reason is thus kept in abeyance and full sway is given to the emotions. People give way to emotions disturbance during theatrical performance of which they would be ashamed in real life. Poetry that has deflating effect, it leads to a loss of balance. He condemns poetry in his Republic for the poets. Feed and water the passion instead of drying them off, and let them rule instead of ruling them as they ought to be ruled, with a view to the happiness and virtue of mankind. And the Republic, chapter 10, Plato discusses the emotions of pity and grief. These emotions should be restrained. But in tragedy, people give in uncontrolled expressions to these emotions. Thus, they play a woman part, though pity and grief, gentle, human emotions, not violent and antisocial like sex, revenge. Yet Plato is opposed not merely to the violent or anti-social emotions, but to all emotions such as pity and grief. Plato takes poetry on intellectual ground as well. He thinks that the poetry have no knowledge of truth, for they imitate inference and not like the truth of the things, illusion instead of reality. Poets like painters imitate the surface or the superficial aspect of things. Beyond the world of the senses there is another world, the world of ideal reality, where concepts like truth, virtue, beauty, etc. exist in an ideal form. The phenomena are mere illusions, a reflection or a shadow of the ideal world. The poets have no knowledge of reality. They simply imitate the shadow or the illusionary. Poetry is twice removed from the reality. It cannot be a source of knowledge and truth. It can tell us nothing about the essential reality. Poetry is the product of futile ignorance, the poet who imitates without really knowing what he is imitating. He lacks in purpose and lacks in knowledge. He writes there are three arts which are concerned with all things, one which uses, another which makes, a third which imitates them. The fourth stands the lowest, for neither does he use nor does he make. He merely imitates. Poetry can serve no useful practical purpose. It must be apart from school curriculum. Does Plato take poetry on intellectual, emotional, utilitarians, and moral grounds and demonstrate its uselessness and its corruptions? And plus, he end his charges against poetry by saying that in ideal state no poetry should be admitted, save except hymns to the gods and panegyrics on famous men. The poets are to be honored, but they are to be banished from his ideal state. The fact is that much of his adverse criticism of poetry is a sort of special pleading on behalf of philosophy as more suitable subjects for education of the youth. In Plato time society and political life was corrupt and degenerated, and according to him the true remedy in accepting philosophy as a guide to right conduct their part like a clever advocate he tried to support his point of view. For example, the evil effect of imitation and emotions are emphasized, while their possibility of God, good, and their powers of stimulating and elevating human natures are constantly ignored. He couldn't have been blind in these facts, but his duty as advocate compelled to him minimize their importance. Thus, if he attack on food is considered a kind of special feeling, it becomes more explicable and understandable. He is not pronouncing judgments about terminating the pros and cons, but merely holding a brief for his client philosophy. I think you understand the topics. I explain it in very easy way. That at what grounds he criticized poetry and why he banished poetry from his ideal state. These are his comments. So please share, comments, and like this video, and wait for another video. His answers, Aristotle answer to Plato. Thank you for watching.